a piece of paper to which we ascribe value. Perhaps that's why I never placed too much value on it. My name is Webster Holland. I am 68 years old, and I have lived all my life in Oxnard, a small town on the coast of California. The house in which I have lived for the past 36 years is unremarkable. It's a one-story, three-bedroom structure with a shabby roof and a modest lot. My neighbors probably think I'm a typical retiree who barely makes ends meet. I don't mind. The habit of living modestly has been ingrained in me over decades of work as a petroleum geologist. Every morning I walk out onto the porch, coffee mug in hand, cracked from time. My clothes are plain jeans and flannel shirts that I buy at the local department store when the old ones wear out. My car is a used Ford that is almost 15 years old. At first glance, the life of an ordinary old man living out his days in a quiet corner of California. What few people know is that underneath this image is a man whose bank account would be the envy of many Oxnard residents. I've never aspired to luxury, partly because I've seen how money changes people, and not always for the better. Partly because I learned early on that the more you have, the more you fear to lose. My hands are covered with calluses from working, not only professionally, but also from fiddling in the garden, from repairing the old house myself. My face is wrinkled from sun, wind, and time. I look my age, maybe even older, and it has never bothered me. Torrance, my only son, was born when I was 32. His mother, Lydia, died of cancer when he was only 15. It's been just the two of us ever since. I tried to give him everything he needed, a good education, a roof over his head, support, but I never spoiled him with money. Maybe that was my mistake. Unlike me, Torrance always had a taste for the good life. Expensive cars, fancy clothes, restaurants with unpronounceable names. I didn't judge him, I just didn't understand him. And he didn't understand me. "Dad, why do you live like a bum when you can afford so much more?" He'd ask me when he came to visit from college. "I live as I'm comfortable," I'd answer, and that was usually the end of our conversation. When Torrance met Priscilla, I realized I'd lost him for good. She was the embodiment of everything I thought was empty and meaningless. Bright, loud, with impeccable manicures, and a habit of photographing her every move for social media. Their wedding, on which I had spent a significant portion of my savings at their request, resembled a circus show. 200 guests, many of whom I was seeing for the first time. Exotic food, designer bridesmaid dresses, expensive alcohol. "You realize we need to impress my clients," Torrance said when I gently asked if we could keep things modest. I didn't realize at the time that impressing had become their raison d'etre. After the wedding, our relationship gradually waned. The calls became less and less frequent, the visits shorter and shorter. I noticed how they looked at each other when I offered them a home-cooked meal instead of going to a restaurant. The way they wrinkled their brows when they sat down on my worn couch. The way they looked around my house with barely concealed contempt. "You should move to a nursing home, Dad," Torrance once told me. "This house is too big for you alone, and you're not old enough to take care of it." "I'm 65, not 95, I replied then, "and I'm doing just fine." It was one of the last conversations we had before the stroke happened. I remember that day with terrifying clarity. I was working in the garden, weeding the tomato beds. Suddenly, the world in front of my eyes swam. A sharp pain shot through the right side of my body and then numbness. I tried to call for help, but I couldn't speak. The last thing I remember before I lost consciousness was the feeling of wet earth under my cheek and the smell of tomato leaves. I woke up in the hospital. The worried faces of Torrance and Priscilla were leaning over my bed. At that moment, I felt a surge of hope. Maybe blood ties were stronger in a critical situation. "Dad, you scared us," Torrance said, squeezing my hand. His eyes were red from sleep. "A neighbor found you when she stopped by to borrow some garden shears. You'd been there for hours. I couldn't speak. The tube in my throat was getting in the way. But I squeezed his hand in return, hoping he would understand my gratitude. The first days after the stroke were the worst of my life. The right side of my body hardly worked at all. I couldn't eat on my own, use the toilet, or turn around in bed. My speech came back, but it was slurred like a drunk. The doctors spoke of cautious optimism. The stroke was moderate, and with proper rehabilitation, I could regain most functions. To my surprise, Torrance and Priscilla were there for me at first. They came to the hospital every day, talking to the doctors, bringing magazines and fruit. "Don't worry, Dad," Torrance said. "We'll get everything organized. When you're discharged, you'll stay with us for a while. We have a guest room on the first floor, so you won't have to climb the stairs. I was touched and grateful. Perhaps I had judged them unfairly all these years. Perhaps deep down inside they cared for me after all. I was discharged 2 weeks later with a whole list of recommendations, medications, and specialist appointments. As Torrance had promised, he took me into his home. Their home was exactly what I expected. Large, modern, with designer furniture and spotlessly clean surfaces. The guest room they put me in looked like an expensive hotel room, impersonal and sterile. Things went well for the first few days. Torrance worked from home to keep an eye on me. Priscilla cooked meals according to the special diet the doctor had prescribed. They helped me with my exercises, took me to specialist appointments, and kept me on my medication. But then I started to notice a change. Torrance locked himself in his office more and more often, citing important calls. Priscilla became irritable, especially when I needed help in the bathroom or was changing clothes. I didn't sign up to be a nurse, I heard her hiss at Torrance once behind a closed door. We have to hire someone. I can't live like this. I have my own job, my own things to do. I know, honey, but it's too expensive, Torrance replied. Specialized care costs a fortune, and Dad hardly has that kind of money. He's always lived like a pauper. Then let him go to a public hospital or something. It's not our problem. Their conversation hit me harder than a stroke. At that moment, I realized they didn't care about me. They cared about their reputation, about what people would say if they found out that their son had sent his sick father to the state house. That night was the first time I told them about my savings, that I could pay for a private nurse and rehab at the best clinic in town. The look on their faces was priceless, a mixture of disbelief, surprise, and, most sadly, greed. But Dad, why didn't you ever tell me? Torrance asked, and I heard a note of reproach in his voice, as if it were my fault that they thought me poor. You never asked, I answered simply. The next day, a nurse showed up at the house, a young Filipina named April, with kind eyes and strong hands. She helped me with exercises, bathing, and eating. Torrance and Priscilla almost stopped coming into my room, as if my presence in their home had become even more uncomfortable now that they knew about my finances. A week later, Torrance stopped by my room before bedtime. He looked awkward, shuffling from foot to foot at the door. Dad, Priscilla, and I were thinking, maybe it would be better for you to come home. With April, of course. It's just that we have constant meetings and guests here, and it's probably noisy and uncomfortable for you. I almost laughed. Of course, it wasn't about my comfort, it was about theirs, I agreed without hesitation. We'll visit you every weekend, Torrance promised, but I saw relief in his eyes, not genuine concern. So I was back in my old house with April, medical equipment, and a schedule of rehab treatments. Torrance and Priscilla stopped by twice in the first month, for 15 minutes at a time, as if checking in to clear their consciences. Then their visit stopped altogether. I'm sorry, Dad. We're going through a very busy time at work, Torrance said over the phone. As soon as we're free, we'll come right over. But they never did. The calls became fewer, shorter, more formal. Soon they stopped altogether. I didn't call back. Pride, I guess. Or maybe it was just the realization that our lives had finally drifted apart. April turned out to be a real blessing. Patient and positive, she turned an excruciating exercise into an almost enjoyable endeavor. Under her guidance, I was making noticeable progress. Within 3 months, I could walk with a cane, dress myself, and cook simple meals. My speech was almost completely restored. Mr. Webster, you're doing great, she said with a big smile. Many people give up, but you fight. In those days, I often dreamed of Lydia. I imagined her sitting next to me as I exercised and quietly encouraging me. I wondered what she would say about my and Torrance's rift. She's always been softer than me, always finding excuses for people's actions. He's just different, Webbs, she'd say when Torrance, as a child, demanded new toys or fancy clothes like his rich classmates. Not everyone is cut out for the simple life. Sometimes I wondered if it was all my fault. Maybe I should have been a different father, more generous, less principled. Give him everything he wanted? But then I remembered my father, who taught me to value labor over things, who used to say, money comes and goes, Webster, but dignity stays with you forever. I've been thinking about that a lot, sitting on the porch of my house, watching the sun go down over the horizon. about how Torrance and I had become such strangers to each other, about how his wife seemed to reinforce that chasm between us, about how I would probably never see them again unless I made the first move. But did I want to make it? Did I want to return to a relationship that was built on commitment rather than sincere affection? I didn't know the answers to those questions. All I knew was that I would survive. I'd always survived, with or without Lydia, with or without Torrance. Life went on, even when it seemed like all the doors had closed. There were still many days ahead of me, and I decided to live them the way I thought was right. No regrets, without looking back at the past, and maybe a little differently than before. Recovering from the stroke proved to be a long and agonizing process. Every morning began with the same ritual. I slowly got out of bed, trying not to make any sudden movements so as not to provoke dizziness. Then, leaning on my cane, I went to the bathroom, where I stood under the warm jets of the shower for 20 minutes, letting the water warm up my still not fully recovered muscles. Then, breakfast, medication, exercises, day after day, week after week. After April stopped coming every day and visited me only 3 times a week, the house fell into silence, broken only by the ticking of the old wall clock, a gift from Lydia for our 10th anniversary. Sometimes I turned on the radio, but more often I preferred the silence. It allowed me to think, and I thought a lot, about the years gone by, about lost opportunities, about the fact that life flew by so fast, and I kept putting off real life for later. Retirement, for when I'd saved up enough. Funny, I had saved more than enough, but never allowed myself to enjoy it. One such day, as spring was giving way to summer and my exercise was beginning to bear tangible fruit, I could walk almost without a cane and speak without stuttering. I decided to take a walk to the post office. I usually asked a neighborhood boy to pick up my mail for $5 a week, but that day the weather was especially nice, and I wanted to see how far I could walk on my own. The drive took twice as long as before, but I made it without too much trouble. In the mailbox, besides the usual bills and flyers, I found a letter from my financial advisor, Huxley Penn. He hadn't written to me in many months, not since I'd been in the hospital. "Dear Mr. Holland," he wrote in his neat handwriting, "I hope this letter finds you in good health. I have tried to contact you by telephone several times, but without success. I would like to discuss some investment opportunities that may interest you. Please contact me at your earliest convenience." I folded the letter and thought for a moment. Before my stroke, I had met regularly with Huxley, discussing investments, monitoring the state of my portfolio. But after the illness, all of that had somehow fallen by the wayside. It seemed unimportant. Now looking at the letter, I felt a strange excitement, as if something inside me was awakening after a long sleep. When I got home, I called Huxley at once. He answered after the first ring, as if he had been sitting by the phone waiting for my call. "Webster," he exclaimed with genuine joy, "how glad I am to hear your voice. How are you feeling?" "Better than I expected," I replied, surprised at my own optimism. "The doctors say that the recovery is going faster than they predicted." "That's great. That's great." His enthusiasm was contagious. "When can I see you again? I have some ideas I'd like to discuss with you." We arranged to meet the next day. Huxley insisted on coming to my home, saving me the trouble of traveling to his office downtown. When he showed up on my doorstep the next day with a leather briefcase and a paper bag from the bakery, I was struck by how little he'd changed over the months. Still the same neat suit, still the same haircut, still the same attentive gaze. He was a constant in my changing world. "I brought blueberry muffins," he said, holding out the bag. "Your favorite, if I remember correctly." We settled into the living room. Huxley laid out charts, tables, and printouts on the coffee table. "Your portfolio has shown remarkable resilience even in these turbulent times," he began, pointing to one of the charts. "The conservative strategy we've chosen has paid off." But, he paused, "I think it's time to consider some more aggressive options." I listened to him, sipping my coffee and looking at the numbers. They used to thrill me. Every percentage increase, every dollar of dividends seemed like a small victory, a step toward the financial security I longed for. Now they just seem like numbers, symbols on paper. "Huxley," I interrupted him in the middle of a sentence about the outlook for the technology sector. How much money do I have now? Total. He blinked, clearly surprised by the question. Well, if you count all your assets, including real estate, stocks, bonds, and cash, he did some quick calculations in his mind. About $4,700,000, give or take a few tens of thousands, depending on market fluctuations. I nodded, digesting the information. Almost $5 million. What had I been doing with them all these years? Watching it grow like it was a video game account. Not real money that could make my life better. How much do I spend a year, I asked, even though I knew roughly the answer. Huxley did the quick calculations again. According to your bank statements, about $60,000 a year, including taxes, insurance, utilities, and all other expenses. I shook my head. $60,000 a year on a fortune of almost $5 million. Even if I didn't get any investment income, that money would be enough for 80 years? I laughed. Is something wrong? Huxley asked anxiously. Nothing is wrong, I answered. It's just that I suddenly realized the absurdity of the situation. I live as if the world were going to end tomorrow, and I need to save every penny. In fact, if I started spending 10 times what I'm spending now, I'd still have enough money for the rest of my life. Huxley smiled, but there was something sad in his smile. You know, Webster, I've been telling you this for years, that it's time to start enjoying the fruits of your labor. But you've always said that what you have is enough. It was, I nodded. Enough, but no more than that. I've always lived enough. Not bad, not good, just enough not to feel the need. I paused, looking out the window at my small garden. You know, when I was lying in the hospital, paralyzed and unable to speak, I wasn't thinking about money. I thought about the things I never did, about the places I hadn't visited, about the moments of joy I missed because I was too busy saving for a future that might never come. Huxley listened silently without interrupting. He had always had that ability to really listen. I want to change that, I continued. I want to start living, not just existing. While there's still time, I'm glad to hear that, Huxley replied sincerely. And what do you want to do first? I hesitated. What did I want? What had I been missing all these years? A new house for starters, I said, surprising myself. Not necessarily a big one, but a nice one. An ocean view, maybe. And a new car. Something that starts right up and doesn't squeak over every bump. Huxley nodded, pulling out a notebook and starting to make notes. A house by the ocean, a new car. What else? Traveling, I answered after a pause. I've always wanted to see Europe, Italy, France, Greece. Lydia dreamed of Paris, but we never went there. There were always more important things to do, more urgent expenses. Huxley kept writing, and I kept talking, marveling at how easy it was to express my desires. It was as if a dam inside me had burst, and everything I'd held back for years was coming out. Nice clothes, I added. Not designer, but quality, comfortable, a good restaurant now and then. Books, not from the library, but my own so I could make notes and not have to return them in 2 weeks. When I stopped talking, Huxley pulled back from his notes and looked at me with a smile. Do you know what strikes me most, Webster? That in your condition, your desires are still so modest. A lot of people in your position would be planning to buy a yacht or a private jet by now. I laughed. I'm 68 years old, Huxley. I don't need yachts and airplanes. I need comfort, good experiences, and a little joy in my remaining years. I paused, and perhaps a chance to surprise those who thought I was a poor old man living out my days in oblivion. Huxley raised an eyebrow but said nothing. He knew about my strained relationship with my son and daughter-in-law. I'd been telling him about it for years. He was probably the only person I could talk to about anything without being secretive. So where do we start, he asked, putting aside his notebook. The car, I decided. That's the easiest. Then we'll look for a house. Great. What brand do you prefer, I wondered. Torrance and Priscilla always spoke of expensive cars with such reverence, as if they were sacred relics. Porsche, Mercedes, BMW. They pronounced the names with breath. Dash Porsche, I said, surprising myself again. Something modern and noticeable. Huxley smiled but said nothing about my choice. I can arrange a test drive next week if you'd like. That would be great. When Huxley left, I sat in the chair for a long time, looking at the list we'd made. It seemed both daunting and exciting at the same time. It was like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, preparing to jump into the unknown. That night, I began researching the real estate market in Oxnard and neighboring cities. I'd never dreamed of owning a house by the ocean before. It seemed like a pointless luxury. Now I was surprised to find that I could afford one. In fact, I could buy more than one if I wanted to. The next weeks flew by in a whirlwind of activity. I met with realtors, looked at houses, test drove various Porsche models. My body was still failing me. I was fatigued quickly, and sometimes an arm or leg would suddenly refuse to obey. But I felt more alive than I had in years. My first major purchase was a car, a Porsche Cayenne, a fiery red crossover that cost more than my entire previous lifestyle of 5 years. When I first got behind the wheel, my hands shook, not from weakness after the stroke, but from excitement. "This is too much," I muttered to myself as I looked at the numbers on the sales contract. But then I remembered Torrance and Priscilla talking about me in their house, thinking I couldn't hear. He always lived like a beggar. And something inside me clicked. I signed the papers without further hesitation. The next step was the house. After looking at over 20 options, I found what I was looking for. A small but elegant cliffside home with panoramic views of the Pacific Ocean. 3 bedrooms, a large terrace, a modern kitchen, and, most importantly, absolute privacy. The nearest neighbors were 100 meters away, separated from me by dense vegetation. The price was astronomical by the standards of the old Webster, but the new one I just signed the check without blinking an eye. When the keys were in my hand, I felt strangely relieved. It was like dropping a heavy backpack I'd been carrying my whole life. The move had only taken a few days. I didn't have many things I wanted to take with me. Old furniture, old clothes, old dishes, all of it seemed alien now, belonging to another life. I kept only a few memorabilia. Photographs of Lydia, her favorite vase, books with her notes in the margins. A new house required a new filling. I hired an interior designer, a young woman named Olivia, with bright hair and bold ideas. She didn't try to cater to the tastes of the typical retiree, for which I was grateful. "Your home should reflect you, Mr. Holland," she said at our first meeting. "Not who you were, but who you want to be now." I reflected on her words. What did I want to be? Not just a rich old man compensating for years of self-restraint, not just a father wanting to impress an ungrateful son. Someone big, someone who lives life to the fullest without looking back at the past or fearing the future. Together with Olivia, we created a space that was both comfortable and stylish. Large windows, light-colored walls, comfortable but elegant furniture. Nothing flashy or ostentatious, just quality things that pleased the eye and lifted the mood. In parallel with organizing the house, I updated my closet. I threw out all the old flannel shirts and baggy jeans. In their place were well-cut suits, cashmere sweaters, Italian leather boots. When I first saw myself in a full-length mirror wearing my new clothes, I didn't recognize the man staring back at me. He looked dignified, confident, like a man who knows his worth. My life began to fill up with new people. Olivia introduced me to her friends. Artists, musicians, writers. Huxley introduced me to his other clients, successful businessmen and investors. I began to attend exhibitions, concerts, and dinners at good restaurants. The changes affected not only my appearance and surroundings, but also my habits. I started trying new dishes, listening to new music, reading books that I used to find too complicated or too frivolous. I signed up for swimming lessons. The doctor said it would be great for stroke recovery. I hired a chef who came 3 times a week and cooked meals I couldn't even pronounce correctly before. But the most amazing change was what was happening inside of me. The guilt about spending money that had haunted me all my life was slowly fading away. It was replaced by a sense of rightness, like everything was finally falling into place. I often thought about Lydia. What would she say if she saw me now? Would she approve of my change, or would she think I'd gone mad in my old age? Sometimes, standing on the terrace of my new house and watching the sun set over the ocean, I could almost hear her laugh in her voice. "Live, Webbs. Just live." And I lived. Every day I discovered something new. Every day I allowed myself something I had denied myself before. Every day I felt the weight of the past slowly let go of me. I tried not to think about Torrance and Priscilla. They hadn't called or written since I'd returned from their home to mine. I hadn't sought contact with them. Part of me wanted to show them how my life had changed, to see the surprise on their faces. But the other part, the more mature, wiser part, realized that it would be a waste of time and emotion. They had chosen their path. I chose mine. Sometimes, though, I caught myself thinking, what would they say if they saw me now? Sitting behind the wheel of a Porsche, wearing a suit by a famous designer, living in a house they could only dream of? Would they believe their eyes? Would they try to come back into my life after learning of my condition? These thoughts came and went. I didn't let them linger for long. My new life was too fulfilling, too interesting to waste on resentment and regret. And yet, somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew our paths would cross again. Oxnard isn't such a big city. Sooner or later, we'd meet. And when we do, I'll be ready. Not for reconciliation. That bridge was burned a long time ago. But to meet as an equal with equals, as a man who has finally learned to value himself and his life. Despite the fact that I had already bought a Porsche Cayenne, the thought of another car kept me on my toes. The crossover was practical, comfortable for everyday travel, but there was still room in my garage for something special. Something that wouldn't just be a means of transportation, but the realization of a dream I'd been putting off for decades. The thought of a sports coupe came by accident during one of my new rituals. Saturday coffee on the patio overlooking the ocean. I was leafing through an automobile magazine when I came across an article about Porsche's new 911 model. Something about the curves of this car, its aggressive elegance, hooked me. I caught myself rereading the article over and over again, studying the specs, looking at the photos. Why not? I muttered, setting the magazine aside. After all, I deserved it. The idea crystallized into a solution in a matter of minutes. I picked up the phone and dialed the Porsche dealership in Oxnard. Good morning, I said to the pleasant female voice that answered the phone. I'd like to know if you have the new 911 model in stock. There was a short pause. Yes, sir. We have a few in stock, the voice answered with a note of surprise. They probably didn't get many direct requests for cars in this price range. Would you like to sign up for a test drive? Yes, if possible. Today. Another pause. Certainly, sir. May I have your name for the appointment? Webster Holland. All right, Mr. Holland. We can offer you a time of 14:30. Will that suit you? Quite, I answered and hung up, feeling a strange excitement I hadn't felt in years. The day was unusually clear and warm. I chose one of my new suits, a dark blue one, made of a fabric that the tailor said was called Super 140. What exactly that meant, I didn't know, but it fit perfectly and gave me the kind of wealthy look I still wasn't used to. The Porsche dealership was in a new shopping complex on the outskirts of Oxnard. I had intentionally driven my old Ford to the dealership to get a sense of the contrast between my past and future life. Once parked, I sat in the car for a few minutes, gathering my thoughts. Buying the Cayenne had been impulsive, almost a protest. Today's decision was more deliberate, and from that, even more exciting. When I entered the dealership, I was greeted by a young woman with a flawless smile and impeccable hair. Mr. Holland? I'm Eleanor. We spoke on the phone. Welcome to our dealership. She led me through the showroom, where gleaming cars of various models stood under directional lights like exhibits in a museum of modern art. You said you were interested in the new 911, Eleanor said. We have several options. The base model, the S, and the turbo. Which one are you interested in? I almost laughed. Until a month ago, I wouldn't have known the difference between these modifications. But thanks to that magazine and subsequent internet research, I could now discuss the specs almost equally. I think turbo, I replied. If you do something, you do it right, don't you? Eleanor smiled wider. Absolutely, Mr. Holland. Let me show you our copy. She led me to a car that stood in the far corner of the hall. Black, low, with predatory lines and huge wheels. It looked as if it were ready to take off even when standing still. Porsche 911 Turbo S, Eleanor said proudly. 650 horsepower, 100 kilometers per hour in 2 and 5/10 seconds. Top speed 330 kilometers per hour. I walked around the car, admiring every detail, then leaned over to peer into the interior through the window. May I asked, pointing to the door. Sure. Eleanor nodded and opened the door for me. I got behind the wheel and the car felt like it was hugging me. The leather seat, adjustable in every conceivable direction, adjusted perfectly to my back, which still occasionally ached from the stroke. The soft, leather-wrapped steering wheel felt like it was begging to be gripped. The dashboard with its multitude of dials and displays looked like the cockpit of a spaceship. It's impressive, I said, running my hand over the dashboard. This is just the beginning, Eleanor smiled. Wait until you test drive it on the road. Ready for a test drive? I nodded and she went to do the paperwork. While I waited, looking at the interior details, studying the buttons and switches, familiar voices came from behind the glass doors. I looked up and froze. Torrance and Priscilla were entering the cabin. My son was dressed in a business suit, which I noticed at once was not as good quality as mine. Priscilla was flaunting a white dress that seemed too dressy for an ordinary day. They did not notice me at once. They were too absorbed in their conversation among themselves. I saw Priscilla arguing emotionally and Torrance shaking his head with an expression of resignation on his face. I knew that expression all too well, the way he always looked when he gave in to his wife's pressure. They were met by another counselor, a young man in a suit that didn't fit him as well as Eleanor's uniform. They exchanged greetings, and then the counselor led them deeper into the salon in my direction. I could get out of the car and show myself to them. I could have stayed where I was and waited for them to notice me, but instead I lowered my head, pretending to be completely absorbed in studying the dashboard. Something inside me wanted to hear what they were going to talk about, unaware of my presence. Here it is, I heard the counselor's voice say. A Porsche Macan, a great choice for a young family, sporty yet practical. How much does it cost? Torrance asked in a tone I knew all too well, the tone of a man who already knew the answer, but was hoping for a miracle. The base model starts at $60,000, the consultant replied. But this model with the optional package would cost $75,000. I heard Priscilla draw in a sharp intake of air. We can afford it, Torrance, she said quietly but insistently, especially if we take out a 5-year loan. Prissy, we've already discussed this, Torrance replied with a note of weariness in his voice. With our mortgage and your credit cards, one more payment would just drown us. But everyone at the agency drives one of these cars. Priscilla's voice turned cranky. How can I be a successful realtor if I can't even afford a decent car? Maybe you'd be interested in leasing, the consultant suggested, clearly sensing the tension between the couple. It reduces the monthly payments considerably. We're just looking at it, Torrance cut him off. Maybe in a year or two, when our financial situation is more stable. I heard Priscilla sigh heavily. It's always the same. A year from now, 2 years from now. In the meantime, I'll just keep driving my wreck and looking like a loser in front of my clients. At that moment, Eleanor returned with the test drive paperwork. Seeing the other visitors so close to the car I was sitting in, she frowned slightly. Mr. Holland, everything is ready for the test drive, she said loudly. I got out of the car and straightened up. It was only then that Torrance and Priscilla noticed me. Their expressions changed in slow motion, from annoyance and disappointment to surprise, then to shock, and finally to something I couldn't quite pinpoint, maybe embarrassment, maybe disbelief. Daddy question, Mark Torrance said, as if he'd seen a ghost. Hello, Torrance, I answered calmly. Priscilla, I didn't expect to see you here. They looked at each other, clearly unsure of what to say. The counselor, feeling awkward, took a step back. What are you doing here? Torrance finally asked. Same as you, I guess, I answered, watching cars. Their eyes slid to my suit, then to the car I'd just gotten out of. Are you going to buy a Porsche? Priscilla's voice sounded incredulous. Not just any Porsche, Eleanor interjected with a professional smile. A Porsche 911 Turbo S, our top-of-the-line model, but Torrance hesitated, trying to collect his thoughts. Where'd you get the money for a car like that? I felt something dark and satisfied inside me. Not pride, not gloating, more like a bitter confirmation of what I'd always known about my son and his wife. I've worked all my life, Torrance, I said evenly, and unlike some people, I know how to manage my finances. Priscilla stepped forward, her face suddenly sweet as honey. Webster, you look terrific. Dash, she exclaimed. That suit suits you so well. And how you've improved since, well, after your illness. We were so worried. Were you? I asked, not hiding my skepticism. In 6 months, not one call, not one message. That's a strange way to express concern. Torrance at least had the conscience to look ashamed. Dad, you know how busy we are. Work, home, social obligations. He paused. But we've thought of you often. We really have. Eleanor, sensing the tension, intervened softly. Mr. Holland, if you're ready, the car is waiting for you in the parking lot for a test drive. I nodded to her and turned to leave, but Priscilla quickly blocked my way. Webster, wait! Torrance and I were just talking the other day about reestablishing family ties. Why don't you come over for dinner this Friday night? I'll make your favorite pecan pie. I looked at her, trying to figure out if she really believed I would buy into this sudden bout of family warmth right after they found out about my finances. My favorite pie is apple and cinnamon pie, I said. Lydia used to bake it every Sunday. But of course you couldn't know that because you've never taken any interest in anything that concerns me personally. Priscilla's face trembled slightly, but she quickly restored her smile. Of course it's apple. I just got mixed up. Anyway, we'll be very happy to see you. Right, Torrance? My son nodded, but in his eyes I could see a mixture of embarrassment and calculation. He'd always been a bad liar. You know what, I said, looking at them both. Let's do this another way. After the test drive, I'm going to formalize the purchase of this car. The process will take some time. If you'd like, we can meet back here in, say, a couple hours and have dinner together. I know a great restaurant nearby. Their eyes lit up at the mention of the restaurant. Priscilla even clapped her hands like a child. That would be wonderful, Dash, she exclaimed. We're just getting off in 2 hours, aren't we, darling? Torrance nodded, though I was sure they had no plans for the day, except to look at cars they couldn't afford. That's settled then, I said. I'll see you back here at 16:30. I followed Eleanor to the exit, feeling the glances of my son and daughter-in-law on my back. They were probably already calculating how much they could get from me now that they knew my financial situation. The test drive was a revelation. Even though my right arm still hadn't fully recovered from the stroke, I was able to handle the power of this car. Eleanor sat beside me, explaining the functions of the various buttons and switches, but I barely listened to her. All my attention was on the sensations, the roar of the engine, the force of the acceleration against the seat, the precision of the steering. It's incredible, I said as we drove back to the dealership parking lot. Yeah, she makes that impression on everyone, Eleanor smiled. What do you think? I'll take it, I said without hesitation. The next hour was spent in paperwork and discussing details. I chose the full configuration, added all the options, and ordered personalized license plates. All this time I had a strange feeling, a mixture of euphoria from the purchase and bitterness from the meeting with my son and daughter-in-law. When all the paperwork was signed and the first payment, in cash to the obvious surprise of the sales manager, was made, I walked out into the showroom. Torrance and Priscilla were already waiting for me, sitting in the waiting area with cups of coffee from the machine. All set, I said as I approached them. The car will be delivered to my house tomorrow morning. Your house? Torrance interjected. You still live in that old house on Oak Street? I shook my head. No, I've moved. I have a house on the coast now overlooking the ocean. Their faces changed again. I could almost see the gears turning in their heads, calculating my estimated value. Dad, this is amazing, Torrance exclaimed with feigned enthusiasm. Why didn't you tell us? We would have helped with the move. Just like you helped me after my stroke? I asked quietly. There was an awkward pause. Priscilla was the first to break the silence. Webster, we have to admit that we were wrong. We shouldn't have left you alone at such a difficult moment. She put her hand on my shoulder. But we sincerely want to make things right, don't we, Torrance? My son nodded, looking into my eyes almost convincingly. Yes, Dad, we've realized our mistakes, and we want to be there for you, like a real family. I looked at them, at their artfully played remorse, and I felt not anger, not resentment, but fatigue. And somewhere deep inside, disappointment. Disappointment that even now, even in this moment, they couldn't be honest. Well, I said finally, let's discuss this over dinner. I made reservations at the Blue Lagoon. Do you know that place? Priscilla gasped. The Blue Lagoon? But it's the most expensive restaurant in town. You have to make reservations a month in advance. I shrugged. I have connections. We left the dealership and headed for the parking lot. I walked ahead and they followed me, whispering amongst themselves. I could hear scraps of their conversation. I didn't realize he had so much money. Always lived like a pauper. Yeah, maybe help with the down payment on a Macon. At my old Ford, I stopped and turned to them. I'll drive my car, I said. Meet me at the restaurant in 20 minutes. They nodded and Priscilla commented, It's strange you're still driving that old car when you can afford a Porsche. The new one doesn't arrive until tomorrow, I reminded her. This one's doing its job just fine for now. On the way to the restaurant, I thought about what I was going to say to them. Part of me wanted to vent all the bitterness and resentment that had built up over the months. Another part of me thought it would be better to just politely but firmly end the whole relationship. I was still undecided when I parked at the Blue Lagoon. Torrance and Priscilla were already waiting at the entrance. They were visibly nervous as they looked around at the luxury cars in the parking lot and the elegantly dressed people entering the restaurant. Dad, are you sure you have a reservation? Torrance asked as I approached them. This place looks very exclusive. Don't worry, I replied and headed for the entrance. The maitre d' greeted us with a professional smile. Good evening. Do you have a reservation? Yes, under the name Holland, I answered. Table for 3. He checked his list and nodded. Of course, Mr. Holland. Your table is ready. Please follow me. We were escorted to a table by the window overlooking the ocean. Priscilla couldn't hide her admiration as she looked around at the other patrons. It's so beautiful here, she whispered as we sat down. And so expensive. Don't worry about the price, I said. It's my treat tonight. Their faces brightened, and in that moment I realized I had made my decision. I knew what I was going to tell them. I knew how this dinner would end, and in a strange way, that knowledge brought me peace. Dinner at the Blue Lagoon dragged on until almost midnight. Torrance and Priscilla, encouraged by the expensive wine and my apparent generosity, talked nonstop. They talked about their work, about problems with their neighbors, about vacation plans, about a TV show they'd recently started watching, about everything except what really mattered, the 6 months of silence, how they'd kicked me out of their lives after my stroke, how they'd suddenly felt a kinship when they saw me at the Porsche dealership. I smiled, nodded, asked polite questions, paid the bill, which totaled an amount equal to their monthly mortgage, even promised to consider inviting them over for Sunday lunch. But there was a strange feeling growing inside me, a mixture of bitterness, frustration, and, oddly enough, relief. It was as if I had finally seen the situation for what it was, without illusions or self-deception. When I got home, I sat on the terrace for a long time, watching the waves crashing against the rocks below. The night ocean seemed as endless and mysterious as my own future. I poured myself a glass of good whiskey, another recent habit I'd acquired after reevaluating my life, and let my thoughts flow freely. The meeting at the car dealership and the dinner that followed had kept me on my toes, not because I was surprised by Torrance and Priscilla's behavior. Their sudden interest in me after discovering my financial situation was quite predictable. What bothered me was my own attitude toward it. Why hadn't I told them what I thought right there in the restaurant? Why hadn't I refused their phony apology? Why let this farce go on all night? My first impulse was to simply write it all off to my usual restraint, my unwillingness to make a scene in public. But the more I thought about it, the clearer it became that it was something else. The part of me that still remembered Torrance as a little boy afraid of the storm, the part that saw him as an extension of Lydia, her smile, her gestures, that part of me wanted to believe that their remorse was genuine, that they had truly realized their mistakes, that we could start over. The thought made me laugh bitterly. A fresh start? After everything that had happened? After they abandoned me during the hardest time of my life? After 6 months of not even making time for a phone call? And suddenly, when they saw me in an expensive suit, sitting in a Porsche, They remembered the family ties? Number. It wasn't genuine remorse. It was calculation. Pure, unprincipled calculation. I sipped my whiskey, feeling it burn my throat. Memories of that period after the stroke came flooding back. The first days in their house, when they were still trying to pretend to care. Then the gradual estrangement. Priscilla's irritation when I needed help. Torrance's excuses not to spend time with me. And finally, that conversation I overheard. It's not our problem. 4 words that shattered the last illusions I had about my son and his wife. 4 words that revealed who they really were. And now they wanted back into my life. Because they found out I was rich. Because they saw an opportunity to get something for themselves. The whiskey cup trembled in my hand, and I set it down on the table. I took a deep breath, trying to calm down. Anger is a bad counselor, as Lydia liked to say. You have to think clearly. I tried to look at the situation from a detached perspective, as if it were happening to someone other than me. What would I advise a person in my position? I would probably tell him, be honest with yourself. Don't look for excuses for those who hurt you. Don't cling to the past. Move forward. Move forward. Easy to say, harder to do, especially when it comes to your only child. I remembered the moment Torrance was born. Tiny red face wrinkled in a scream. Tiny fingers gripping my thumb with surprising strength. The first tooth, the first step, the first word. Mommy, of course. School performances where Lydia and I sat in the front row, proud and happy. And then the teenage years. The first conflicts. His growing dissatisfaction with our modest lifestyle. Why does everyone else have a normal house and we have this wreck? Why do they all have new cell phones and I have an old one? Why don't we ever go on normal vacations like other families? Lydia's death made things worse. She had always been a buffer between us, softening sharp edges, finding compromises. Without her, it was like we were speaking different languages, not understanding each other. College, my first job, meeting Priscilla, all of that drove us further apart. And then there was the wedding. Lavish, expensive, not my type at all. I paid for it, of course. It was the last thing I could do for my son. After the wedding, our meetings became infrequent and tense. They came once, every few months, staying for an hour or two, obviously counting the minutes until they left. Torrance hardly ever spoke to me alone. Priscilla was always there, guiding the conversation in a direction that was favorable to her. It was usually about money, not directly, of course, but transparently enough. The Blakes have a new pool, can you imagine? Must be worth a fortune. Jessica from my office bought a house in Beverly Hills. They say her parents helped with the down payment. Everyone's going to Europe this year. It would be great to visit Paris or Rome someday. I didn't respond to these hints, and gradually their visits became even less frequent. And then a stroke, a few days in their house, and a final breakup. And now a sudden reconciliation. After 6 months of silence, what am I supposed to do? Accept them back, knowing they're driven only by greed? Or reject them, ending the possibility of a rebound relationship? I picked up the glass of whiskey again, but I didn't drink it. I just held it, staring at the dark liquid shimmering in the moonlight. What would Lydia say? She had always been willing to forgive, always looking for the best in people. People make mistakes, Webbs, she would say, but that doesn't mean they can't change. But could Torrance and Priscilla change? Or had they simply put on new masks, seeing me as a potential source of income? I knew the answer. Saw it in their eyes, heard it in their voices. The way they talked about my new house, the Porsche, the restaurant. It wasn't joy for me. It was greed. Pure, unconcealed greed. Setting the glass down, I got up and walked around the terrace. The night air was cool but not cold. The stars twinkled over the ocean like scattered jewels. It was at times like this that I felt Lydia's absence most keenly. She loved the stars, could talk for hours about constellations and the myths associated with them. See that bright star there, Webbs? That's Vega. In Chinese mythology, it symbolizes a weaver girl who fell in love with a shepherd, represented by the star Altair. I looked up at the sky, trying to find Vega, but the city lights obscured most of the stars. Another reason I love my new home, here away from the city, The night sky was much brighter. My thoughts went back to Torrance and Priscilla, their sudden interest in me, to the fact that money was the only bridge that could connect us again. Money, it's a strange thing. All my life, I've treated it simply as a tool for survival. I didn't worship it like some of my colleagues, didn't chase them, sacrificing health or relationships. Just earning, saving, investing, securing a future, mine, Lydia's, Torrance's, and now that money is the reason my own son suddenly remembers I exist. Ironic. I walked back to the table, grabbed my phone, and opened the photo gallery. I scrolled down to the pictures taken that night at the Blue Lagoon. Torrance and Priscilla, smiling for the camera with glasses of wine in hand. Me at a restaurant table, with a strained smile and tired eyes. The three of us are a reunited family. Fake. It was all fake. And they knew it. And I knew it. But we kept playing it like actors in a bad play. Why? Because it was easier. Because the truth was too painful. Sometimes it's easier to pretend than to face reality, Huxley once said during one of our conversations. He was talking about markets and investors, but the phrase applies to human relationships as well. We were faking it, all three of us. They were genuinely happy to see me. I pretended that I believed in their sudden remorse. But it couldn't go on like this for long. Sooner or later, the mask had to come off. And it was better that it happened on my initiative, and not when they decided it was time to move on to the next stage. Direct request for money. I put the phone away and looked out at the ocean again. The decision crystallized in my mind gradually but inevitably. I will not support this game. I won't pretend that everything is fine, that 6 months of silence can simply be forgotten because of suddenly awakened kinship feelings. I will meet them, one last time, and I'll say what I think. No anger, no accusations, just honesty. And then let it be what it will be. The thought brought a strange relief. It was as if the stone that had been weighing on my chest for months was suddenly gone. I knew what to do. I knew what to say. And I was prepared for the consequences, whatever they might be. I finished the whiskey and went back into the house. The paperwork for the new Porsche was on the living room table, and it had taken most of the evening to complete. The car was to be delivered tomorrow morning. A new toy for the new Webster Holland, a man who had finally learned to live for himself, not for others. But first, a conversation with Torrance and Priscilla. An honest, open conversation. No masks or pretense. I picked up the phone and dialed my son's number. He answered after the second ring, as if he'd been expecting my call. Dad? His voice sounded surprised and something else. Hope or calculation? Torrance, I said. I've been thinking about your invitation to dinner. I'd like to change my plans. Instead of coming to your place, I suggest you and Priscilla come to mine. I want to show you my new home. Pause. I could almost see them looking at each other, smiles blossoming on their faces. Of course, Papa, Torrance finally exclaimed with an enthusiasm that seemed almost genuine. We'd love to come. When is convenient for you? Tomorrow evening, I answered. 7 o'clock. Great. Should we bring anything? Wine? Dessert? Just come, I said. I'll organize everything else myself. After a brief exchange of pleasantries, we said goodbye. I hung up the phone and took a deep breath. Tomorrow. Tomorrow everything would be decided. I spent the rest of the night without sleep, thinking about what I would tell them, how I would explain my position without getting into accusations and recriminations, how I would clearly define the boundaries, leaving no room for manipulation and misunderstanding. By dawn, the plan was ready, not just the words I was going to say, but how I wanted to move forward, with or without them in my life. The morning brought the delivery of a new car, the Porsche 911 Turbo S, black with a burgundy-colored leather interior, looked even more impressive in the daylight than it did in the showroom. The dealership representative gave me a detailed briefing, explained all the features, and helped me adjust the seat and mirrors to my parameters. When he left, I stood in the garage for a long time, just admiring the car. Not because of its cost or the status it represented, but because of what it symbolized for me personally: freedom. Freedom from the limitations I had placed on myself over the years. Freedom from the expectations of others. Freedom to be who I want to be, not who they want me to be. After lunch, I called the catering service and ordered dinner for 3. Nothing too fancy. Good meat, fresh vegetables, quality wine. Enough to show I could afford it, but not so much that it looked like an attempt to impress. Then I spent a few hours getting the house in order. Not that it needed cleaning. The housekeeper who came twice a week kept it perfectly clean. But I needed something to keep my hands busy so I didn't have to think about the conversation I was about to have. By 6 p.m., everything was ready. The table was set, the wine chilled, fresh flowers arranged in the rooms. I showered, shaved, put on one of my new suits, not the most expensive, but elegant enough. Then I went out on the terrace and waited. They arrived at 7. Sharp punctuality had never been their strong suit, but today they were clearly trying to make a good impression. I heard the sound of a car pulling up and went to meet them at the front door. Their faces when they saw my house for the first time were worth every dollar spent on it. Shock, disbelief, envy all flashed in their eyes in a matter of seconds before they pulled on smiles and began to marvel at the wonderful view and great location. But the real shock awaited them inside when they saw the spacious living room with panoramic windows, designer furniture, and artwork on the walls. Priscilla couldn't hide her amazement, walking from one painting to another, from one piece of furniture to another, as if in a museum. "Daddy, this is amazing," Torrance said, trying to control his voice. "I didn't even realize that you—" He fell silent, not knowing how to finish the sentence without giving away his true thoughts. "That I could afford to live like this?" I finished for him with a slight smile. "Yes, Torrance, I am full of surprises." I offered them drinks, gave them a tour of the house. I showed them the bedrooms, the study, the terrace overlooking the ocean. Priscilla gasped in delight, especially when she saw the walk-in closet with its rows of designer clothes and shoes. Torrance was more reserved, but I could see his brain working, calculating the cost of everything he saw. Finally, we returned to the living room where I motioned for them to sit down. It was time for the conversation for which I had invited them. As I looked at their faces, excited, expectant, hopeful, which had nothing to do with a desire to restore family relations, I felt a strange detachment. It was as if I were watching from the sidelines without anger or resentment, just stating the facts. Torrance, Priscilla, I began, and something in my voice made them wary. "I didn't invite you here today just to show you my house or show off my new car. I wanted to talk about us, about what's happened in the last 6 months, and what's next." They looked at each other, and I saw their smiles turn a little strained. They hadn't expected this turn. They thought tonight would be a continuation of last night's dinner, a pleasant, superficial conversation that would gradually lead them to what they really wanted, my wallet. But I had other plans, and it was time to make them known. "I want to be honest with you," I continued, "and I hope for honesty on your part, because without it, any relationship is a waste of time." I paused, gathering my thoughts. What I was going to say next would determine our future, if we had one at all. I filled my glasses with wine and sat down across from Torrance and Priscilla. They looked tense, like students in front of a strict examiner. Priscilla fidgeted nervously with the edge of her designer blouse, and Torrance sat up straight as if he'd swallowed a stick. It was unusual to see them so unsure. Usually they held themselves with superiority, especially when talking to me. "Yesterday at the restaurant," I began quietly, "you talked a lot about how you regretted what happened after my stroke, about how you want to rebuild our relationship, about how important family is to you." I paused, looking into their eyes. I listened to you and thought, it's strange, isn't it? 6 months, you haven't even had time for a phone call. And now, all of a sudden, you're thinking about your feelings of kinship. What's changed? Torrance fidgeted in his chair. "Dad," we explained, "we've had a lot of work. Problems with—" "Please," I interrupted him, raising my hand. "Let's not waste time with excuses that neither you nor I believe. We all know what's changed. You saw me at the Porsche car dealership. You found out I had money. A lot of money." Priscilla tried to feign outrage. "Webster, how can you say that? We were really worried about you. It's just—" "Just what?" I asked. "Just not enough to call and ask how I was feeling? Not enough to stop by at least once in 6 months? Not enough to remember that my favorite pie is apple pie, not pecan pie?" They fell silent, looking at each other. I saw something like shame flicker in their eyes, but it was quickly replaced by calculation. They were still hoping to get out of it, to keep access to my wallet. Look, I continued more gently. I'm not mad at you. I really am. I just want honesty, just for now, just between the three of us. No games or pretenses. Torrance took a sip of wine, gathering his thoughts. Okay, Dad, you're right. We, uh, we weren't there for you when you needed us. And yeah, when we saw you yesterday in that expensive suit, buying a Porsche, he hesitated. It changed our perception of you, about your capabilities, and about how those capabilities might affect your life, I added. He nodded reluctantly. Yes, we thought that maybe you could help us, financially. We're really going through some bad times. Mortgages, loans. I know, I said. I heard your conversation at the car dealership. And about the car you can't afford? Priscilla blushed. Apparently, she remembered her words about a wreck and looking like a loser in front of the customers. But she quickly pulled herself together. Yes, we wanted to ask for your help, she said bluntly. But that doesn't mean we're not happy to see you, not happy that you've recovered from your illness. One doesn't exclude the other. I nodded, honoring her honesty. Delayed and forced, but honesty nonetheless. Thank you for your candor, I said. Now it was my turn to be honest. I stood up and went to the window. The sun was setting, coloring the ocean in shades of gold and purple. It was an incredibly beautiful sight. I'd never had time for moments like this before. I was too busy working, worrying, saving for a future that never came. When I was in the hospital, paralyzed, unable to speak, I thought a lot. I began without turning to them. About life, about death, about what really matters. And do you know what I came to? They were silent, waiting for me to continue. I realized that all my life I had been putting off real life for later. Retirement, for when I'd saved up enough. I had denied myself small pleasures, comfort, travel, all for the sake of future security. I turned to them, and you know what I realized when the doctors told me I could be paralyzed for the rest of my life? That all that money I'd been saving so diligently might be worthless, that I could die without ever really living. I went back to the table and sat down. So when I started to get better, I decided to change my life, to start spending money on myself, on my desires and dreams, on what makes me happy. I paused. And you know what else I decided? To never again waste my time and emotions on people who don't care about me. Torrance flinched as if from a slap. Priscilla opened her mouth to object, but I continued. I'm not saying you're bad people. You're just different, with different values, different priorities, and that's okay. But after you left me alone at the worst time of my life, I realized we're not family. Not in the way that I mean it. Dad, we made a mistake, Torrance said in an almost pleading tone. We were wrong. But can't you give us a second chance? Isn't that what family's all about? Forgiving each other's mistakes? It's not about forgiveness, Torrance, I replied. I don't hold a grudge against you. I really don't. But I also don't believe that your sudden desire to reconnect has anything to do with caring for me. You only became interested in me after you found out about my money. And I don't want a relationship based on financial interest. That's not fair, Priscilla exclaimed, losing control. Yes, we made a mistake. Yes, we need help. But haven't you helped us before? Didn't you pay for our wedding? Didn't you give us the money for the down payment on the house? Why is it different now? I looked her straight in the eye. Because back then, you didn't just want me for the money. Because back then, at least you pretended to care. And now, I shook my head. Now you're not even trying to hide the fact that you're only interested in my fortune. Torrance looked depressed. He'd always been bad at confrontation, preferring to give in, to agree, to avoid open conflict. What do you want, Dad? He asked quietly. What do you expect us to do? That was a good question. What did I really want? What did I see our relationship as in the future, if it was even possible? I want honesty, I answered after a pause, and respect. No pretense, no fake smiles in hopes of financial help. I want a relationship based on mutual care, not on calculation. And you think that's possible? After everything you just said? Priscilla's voice sounded incredulous. I don't know, I admitted. But what I do know is that it's impossible to go on as we did in the restaurant last night. On your part, fake remorse and unconcealed greed. On my side, acquiescence to this game. I stood up and walked over to the small table by the wall where the envelope lay. I took it and returned to the table. I've made my decision, I said, placing the envelope in front of me, and I want you to know about it. Their eyes locked on the envelope. I could almost see the thoughts swarming in their heads. A check? The estate papers? A copy of the will? I've transferred some of my assets into a trust, I continued, a fund to be administered by an independent trustee. Upon my death, the proceeds of the trust will be distributed to a few charitable organizations of my choosing. The rest of my estate will be divided between you and those same organizations in a certain proportion. I opened the envelope and took out the documents from it. Everything is described in detail here. To whom, how much, and on what terms. I want you to read it now, in front of me, so that there are no misunderstandings or disappointments in the future. I handed the documents to Torrance. He took them with trembling hands and he and Priscilla began to read. As they read, their faces changed. Bewilderment, shock, disbelief, and finally realization. But it says here that we'll only get 20% of your fortune, Torrance said, raising a confused look at me. And that's if we demonstrate financial responsibility and self-sufficiency? What does that mean? It means that a trustee of the foundation will evaluate your financial situation before deciding exactly how much you'll receive, I explained. If you live beyond your means, accumulate debt, spend recklessly, you may not get anything. You can't do that, Priscilla exclaimed, jumping up from her chair. It's manipulation, blackmail. No, I objected calmly. It's my money and I decide what I want to do with it. If you think the terms are unfair, you can renounce the inheritance entirely. That's your right. But the other 80% will go to charity? Torrance still couldn't believe what he'd read. You'd rather give your money to strangers than to your own son? I prefer my money to do some good, I answered, to help those who really need it, those who don't have the opportunities, the connections, or the education I gave you. Priscilla laughed bitterly, almost hysterically. And you're still talking about honesty? About not holding a grudge against us? It's revenge, pure revenge for not having us at your bedside 24 hours a day. I looked at her sympathetically. She really didn't understand what it was all about. For her, it was all about money, about material values, the depths of human relationships, of sincere care, of support in difficult moments. All of that was nothing to her. This isn't revenge, Priscilla, I said softly. It's my choice, based on my values and my idea of what's right. I earn that money. I get to decide how it's spent, and I choose to direct most of it to where it can save lives, change destinies, make the world a little better. And what about us, Torrance asked. What about your own family? You'll get enough to live comfortably if you manage those funds wisely, I replied, but not enough to completely forget about the need to work, to develop, to build your own life. I think that's the best I can do for you. They looked at me with disbelief, as if they were seeing me for the first time. Maybe they were. Maybe they'd never seen the real me, just the image they'd created for themselves. An old, boring father with outdated views and an empty bank account. And that's the final decision? Priscilla asked. You won't change your mind? The documents have already been signed and certified, I replied. The trust fund is already in place and functioning. So yes, it's final. Torrance looked devastated. He reread the documents over and over, as if hoping to find a loophole, a mistake, something to challenge. But why? He finally asked. Why now? Why so suddenly? Not suddenly, I corrected him. I'd been thinking about it ever since I'd started recovering from my stroke. But I finally made up my mind after our meeting at the car dealership. When I saw how dramatically you'd changed your attitude toward me once you'd learned about my financial situation. Priscilla snorted and turned away. Torrance continued to stare at the documents with an expression as if they contained a sentence. You know, Papa, he said quietly, I always thought you were a cheapskate, that you denied yourself everything out of some pathological greed, that you save money because you don't know how to spend it. He looked up. And it turns out you're just different, with different values like you said. And I never realized it. There was something like respect in his words, for the first time in a long time. I didn't always understand you either, Torrance, I replied. Your desire for the beautiful life, for status, for recognition, we're really very different. And now what? Priscilla asked. What will happen to our relationship? That's a good question. What would happen to our relationship after this conversation? Could we start over, on new grounds? Or had the chasm between us become too deep? That's up to you, I said honestly. I'm open to a relationship based on mutual respect. No calculations, no expectations of material gain. Just a human relationship. If you're ready for that, I'll be glad. If not, I'll understand. Priscilla shook her head with an expression of genuine bewilderment. I don't understand you, Webster. You have everything, money, a beautiful house, expensive cars. You could be enjoying life, helping your family, be a normal, rich man. And instead you're doing these tests, these trials. Why? To prove some moral point? No, Priscilla, I answered calmly. Not to prove anything. Just to live according to my values, with your understanding of what is right and what is wrong. And you're willing to lose your family on that? She asked. I looked at her for a long moment. Did I have a family, Priscilla? Did I have people who cared about me not because of what they could get from me, but simply because I was me? I'm not sure. Torrance flinched at my words. Something akin to shame appeared in his eyes, but Priscilla only snorted. Well, if you put it that way, I guess you really don't have anyone, she said sharply. And it doesn't look like you will, because normal people don't push away their loved ones because of some abstract principles. She stood up, threw her napkin on the table. I'm not going to listen to this. Torrance, we're leaving. My son looked confused, torn between the desire to follow his wife and some new feeling that I couldn't pinpoint. Go if you want to, I told him. I'm not holding you back, but think about what I said, about a real family, about real relationships, about what's really important in life. He stood up slowly, uncertainly, looked at the papers he still held in his hands. Can I take them with me? He asked. I want to study them more closely. Sure, I nodded. This is a copy. My lawyer has the original. Torrance, Priscilla called from the doorway, her voice tingling with impatience and anger. I'm coming, he said, but he didn't move. Instead, he looked at me as if he wanted to say something, but couldn't find the words. It's all right, I told him. Go on. When you're ready to talk, you know where to find me. He nodded, put the papers back in the envelope, and finally went to the door, where Priscilla was waiting for him, tapping her foot impatiently. I walked them to the exit, stood on the doorstep as they got into their car, an ordinary sedan, not the Porsche Macan Priscilla wanted. Saw them arguing fiercely about something before they drove off. I saw Torrance take one last look at my house before he pulled into the driveway. When their car disappeared around the corner, I went back into the house. I sat down at the table, where the wine glasses and uneaten dinner still stood untouched. I looked at the empty chairs across the table. What did I feel? Relief? Regret? Sadness? It's hard to say. Maybe a little bit of everything. I did what I had to do. Said what I had to say. No anger, no revenge, just, the truth about how I see our relationship, how I see my future. Maybe Priscilla's right. Maybe I lost my family because of my principles. But was it a real family if its only foundation was financial gain? If I wasn't valued for the kind of person I was, but for how much money I had? I got up and went out onto the terrace. The night was clear, starry. The ocean murmured below, endless and indifferent to human dramas. I thought of Lydia, of what she would say now. Would she approve of my actions, or would she think I was being too harsh? I didn't know. I never will. But I believed I had done the right thing. For myself, for my own peace of mind. And maybe even for Torrance and Priscilla, though I doubted they'd appreciate it. I didn't rule out that my son and I would cross paths again. Maybe someday, when time had passed, when emotions had subsided, we could start over, on new terms, with a new understanding of each other. But for now I was free from false expectations, from guilt, from having to conform to other people's ideas of what I should be. 3 months had passed since I had spoken to Torrance and Priscilla. In that time, I hadn't heard from them once. Not a call, not a text, not a chance meeting in town. It's like they just disappeared from my life, or me out of theirs. That's what I expected, though. Priscilla wasn't the type to forgive such a blow to her ego and wallet, and Torrance, despite the glimmer of doubt I saw in his eyes at the end of our meeting, had always been too much under her influence. At first, I often thought of them, wondering what they were doing, what they were talking about, whether they remembered me. But as time went on, these thoughts came to me less and less often. Life went on, and it turned out to be much more intense and interesting than I could have imagined. At the end of June, I finally realized one of my longtime dreams. I went on a trip to Europe, not for 2 weeks as tourists usually do, squeezing maximum attractions into a short vacation. No, I decided to take my time and really immerse myself in the life of the places I was visiting. My first stop was Paris, the city that Lydia had dreamed of, but that we never got to visit together. I rented a small apartment in the Marais neighborhood for a month, not in the tourist center, but where ordinary Parisians lived. Every morning I went to the nearest bakery for a fresh baguette and croissants, sat in small cafes watching the passers-by, strolled through the narrow streets, discovering the city without hurry and fuss. I signed up for French lessons, not because I hoped to become fluent in a month, but simply out of a desire to understand at least the basics of a language so different from English. My teacher was Justine, an elegant woman my age, with silver hair and surprisingly young eyes. "You're American, aren't you?" she asked me at our first class. "Yes, from California," I replied. "And what brought you to Paris? Business? Family?" "A dream," I said simply. "A very old dream." She smiled, and in her smile I saw an understanding I had rarely seen in recent years. "Better late than never, Mr. Holland," she said. "And Paris is a great place to start a new life. Believe me, I know what I'm talking about." I later learned her story, a widow like me, who had lost her husband 10 years earlier, a retired university literature professor who decided to devote herself to her passion, teaching French language and culture to foreigners. We quickly found common ground. We often had lunch together after class, and she showed me parts of Paris that you don't see in guidebooks. "You know, Webster," she said to me one day, when we were sitting in a small restaurant near the Canal Saint-Martin, "I meet a lot of tourists from America. They're all running around, taking pictures, ticking off their lists of places of interest. But you're different. You take your time. It's like you're absorbing the city." "I've had many years to learn to appreciate the moment," I replied, "and many more years spent forgetting it." She nodded understandingly. After Henri died, I too lost the ability to savor the moment. It was like living on autopilot. Work, home, work again. It took a long time to learn to see the beauty around me again. We talked about many things, losses and gains, how perceptions of life change with age. Children, she had a daughter living in Canada. Books, music, art. I don't know if what emerged between us could be called a novel. Rather, it was a deep friendship based on mutual respect and understanding. But it was the first time in a long time that I felt truly alive. When it was time to leave Paris, we exchanged contacts. Justine promised to visit me in California next year when her daughter was in labor. She planned to combine a visit to her future grandchild with a trip to the West Coast. From Paris, I headed to Italy, Florence, Rome, Venice, cities I'd read about all my life but had never seen with my own eyes. I spent 2 to 3 weeks in each, renting apartments rather than staying in hotels. I learned to cook local dishes, attended small concerts and exhibitions, and met people. In Rome, I befriended an elderly artist named Marco, who agreed to give me drawing lessons. I had never held a paintbrush before, unless you count painting a fence, but I had always secretly dreamed of learning. My first attempts were clumsy, to say the least, but Marco was a patient teacher. "Take your time," he said, correcting my hand. "Drawing is not only a technique, but also the ability to see, and you have to learn to see all your life." Under his guidance, I created several landscapes, simple but sincere. One of them, a view of the Tiber from a small bridge near my apartment, I decided to keep and hang at home as a reminder that it is never too late to learn something new. From Italy, I moved on to Greece, where I spent almost 2 months traveling around the islands. Santorini with its whitewashed houses and azure sea, Crete with its ancient history and hospitable inhabitants, Rhodes with its medieval town and beautiful beaches. In Crete, I met a family of fishermen, 3 generations of men, from a gray-bearded grandfather to a freckled teenager, out to sea every morning in an old boat. They invited me to join them, and I spent a few unforgettable days helping to cast nets, sort the catch, and prepare a simple but incredibly tasty meal of freshly caught fish. "You're not like the other tourists," my grandfather Nikos told me as we sat on the pier in the evening, sipping local wine. "They come, take pictures, and leave. And you? It's like you want to be a part of our lives." "Maybe I'm just trying to catch up," I replied. "For too long I lived without noticing the world around me." Nikos nodded understandingly. "You know what I've realized in my 82 years? Life is not about accumulating more money or things. Life is in the moments you live fully, in the people you share those moments with." I thought of Torrance and Priscilla, of their endless pursuit of status and material possessions, about how they were missing out on real life by striving for false goals. I wasn't angry at them. I wasn't judging them. I just pity, because I knew, from experience, how easy it was to lose years in this meaningless race. In early November, I returned to California. My home greeted me with silence and coolness, but not emptiness as I had feared. It had not become a stranger during my absence. On the contrary, I saw it with new eyes and appreciated its beauty and comfort with renewed vigor. The first thing I did was to hang my Roman landscape on the wall in the living room. Then I arranged the souvenirs I had brought back from my trip, not tourist trinkets, but things that held special meaning for me. A piece of rough marble from the Acropolis, a shell found on the beach of Rhodes, a small watercolor of a Parisian cafe given to Justine, a piece of fishing net that Nikos insisted I take as a memento of our friendship. After unpacking, I went out onto the terrace. The day was drawing toward evening, and the sun was slowly sinking toward the horizon, coloring the ocean with golden and pink tones. I stood breathing in the salty air and felt surprisingly calm. Yes, I was back alone. No family, no close relatives. But I didn't feel alone. During these months, I realized that loneliness is not the absence of people around. Loneliness is a lack of connection, of understanding, of sincerity in relationships. One can be surrounded by people and feel infinitely lonely. And you can be alone, but feel connected to the world and people who are far away, but sincerely dear to you. A few days after my return, I received a letter, an ordinary paper letter, which in itself was unusual in these days of electronic communications. The sender was Torrance. I opened the envelope with slight trepidation, not knowing what to expect. The letter was short, just a page written in familiar handwriting that had matured since I'd last seen it when Torrance was a teenager. "Dad," he wrote, "I thought for a long time before I wrote this letter. I didn't know if I'd find the right words. I'm not sure I've found them even now, but I decided to try nonetheless. A lot has changed since the last time I saw him. Priscilla filed for divorce. She said she couldn't be with a man who couldn't provide her with the standard of living she deserved. I didn't put up a fight. I guess somewhere inside I had long ago realized that our marriage wasn't based on values that would stand the test of time. I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about real family, about what it means to care for someone, not for profit, but simply because that person is important to you. And I realized I never really understood it. I didn't understand you. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I don't think I'm entitled to it after everything that's happened. And I'm not asking for a second chance. That should be your decision, not mine. I just wanted you to know that your words didn't go to waste. They made me think, changed my perspective on a lot of things. Now I'm trying to start over. I changed my job. I left real estate sales and got a job at a nonprofit organization that helps veterans find housing. The pay is less, but the work is really satisfying. I don't know if you'll ever want to see me again. If you do, I'd love to. If not, I'll understand. Respectfully, Torrance." I reread the letter several times. I put it aside, went to the window, stood there looking out at the ocean. I came back and read it again. There was no attempt at manipulation in Torrance's words, no hidden requests for money or help. Just honesty. the very honesty I valued so much. I didn't answer right away. I decided to give myself time to think about how I really felt. I didn't want to react impulsively, giving in to a momentary impulse, whether it was joy at a possible reconciliation or distrust based on past experience. Instead, I went about doing something I had been planning even before I received the letter, starting my own charitable foundation. The idea was born while traveling, when I saw how many people in the world needed help and how many problems could be solved with enough resources and desire. It was decided to name the foundation after Lydia. Its main purpose is to support educational programs for children from low-income families, especially in the fields of science and the arts, the very fields that Lydia loved and worked in all her life. I met with lawyers, financial advisors, and philanthropic experts. I spent dozens of hours discussing the details, the structure, the mechanisms of work. It was difficult, at times tedious, but each step brought me closer to my goal of creating something meaningful that would outlive me. In the process, I met many interesting people. A sociology professor from a local university who had been researching education in disadvantaged neighborhoods for decades. An art school principal who created a program for talented children without the means to learn. A former NASA engineer now teaching physics in public schools. Interacting with them enriched me, gave me new ideas, new perspectives. I felt I had finally found my place, my purpose. Not just to spend money on myself, although I did not deny myself pleasures and comforts, but to use it to create something bigger than myself. One evening, sitting on the terrace with a glass of whiskey, a habit I would not give up, I took out Torrance's letter, reread it again, and realized I was ready to respond. I didn't bother writing an email or making a phone call. Instead, I sat down at my desk and wrote by hand like he did. "Torrance," I began, "thank you for your letter, for the honesty I saw in it. Life is a strange thing. Sometimes we need to lose something to truly appreciate it. Sometimes we need to be on the edge to see what really matters. My stroke was such a moment of truth for me. Your divorce may have been one for you. I'm not happy about your breakup with Priscilla. I never wished you pain. But if it led you to reevaluate your values, then perhaps it's for the best in the long run. You're asking if I'd want to see you. Yes, I would. Not to revisit the past. You can't revisit the past, and do you need to? But to maybe start something new. A relationship based not on obligations or expectations, but on mutual respect and understanding. I just got back from a trip to Europe, saw places I've always dreamed of seeing, met people who taught me a lot, started a project that I hope will benefit many, and in all of this, there's a wonderful sense of rightness, like I'm finally where I belong. If you want to come down this Saturday, I'll be home. No expectations, no strings attached. We'll just talk, like two adults who may finally be ready to get to know each other again. Sincerely, your father." I sealed the letter, wrote the address, and set it aside to send in the morning. I don't know what this meeting will bring if it happens. I don't know if it would be possible to rebuild what had been shattered by years of misunderstanding and months of estrangement, but I was willing to try. No illusions, no inflated expectations. Just give it a chance. I spent the rest of the evening looking through photos from the trip. Hundreds of pictures, bright, vibrant, full of light and color. The streets of Paris in the morning mist, sunset over the Roman Forum, the azure sea off the coast of Santorini. But most of all, the photos were of people. Justine in a small cafe, laughing at my pronunciation. Marco looking serious as he corrected my drawing. Nikos's family on the pier, with nets full of silvery fish. These faces, these moments meant more to me than all the material goods I could afford. They were real, sincere, full of life. I closed the album and stepped out onto the terrace. The night was clear, the stars shining over the ocean. I remembered how Lydia had taught me to find the constellations, how she and I had sat on the porch of our old house and dreamed of the future. "Someday, Webbs," she said, "we'll sit like this, old and gray, and look at the stars and know we've lived a good life." I didn't know if she would consider my current life good, but I hoped she would, because I was finally living truly, fully, without looking back at the past and without fear of the future. Sometimes I thought about how my life might have turned out if I had started these changes sooner. if I hadn't waited until a stroke put me on the precipice, if I hadn't spent so many years putting life on hold. But then I remembered Nikos's words that real life is in the moments you live fully. And I realized that there is no point in regretting the past. There is a point in appreciating the present and looking optimistically to the future. The future which now seemed to me not a dim, lonely existence, but a bright, full of adventures road. Maybe Torrance would reappear on that road, no longer as an obligation or a source of frustration, but as an equal, as a friend. Maybe there would be new friends, new places, new discoveries. I was ready for all of that, open to new possibilities, free from the limitations I had placed on myself for years. I looked up to the sky and found Vega, the very star Lydia had told me about, bright, distant, eternal. The symbol of a weaver girl in love with a shepherd from the other side of the Milky Way. "See, Lydia," I whispered, "I had learned to live at last." And I thought the star blinked a little brighter, as if in approval. Perhaps it was just a play of imagination, but in that moment, standing on the terrace of my house, looking up at the stars over the ocean, I felt in perfect harmony with the world and with myself. Felt that all the decisions I had made, from breaking up with a toxic relationship to creating a new life, were the right ones. Mine. Real. And that feeling was worth all the money in the world.